So good evening. My name is Hannah Choflat. If I have not met you before, I'm a community member here in Hutchinson, and I read the book for this evening, and I'm very excited to be your host. Again, we're super excited to have you joining us for the 2021 Hutchinson One Book, One Community program. This year's feature book, This Tender Land by William Kent Krueger, truly became an ideal selection for our current times. Not only did this novel pull readers in with a gripping story and strong characters, this novel left readers' hearts and minds filled with messages of hope, courage, and resiliency. Tonight, we're thrilled to be able to share with you a virtual author program. There were many collaborators and people working behind the scenes to make this program possible. Program collaborators included the One Book, One Community Committee, Hutchinson Health, the Hutchinson Leader, and the Hutchinson Public Library. Thanks also to Cashwise Foods and the Village Shop for making copies of This Tender Land available for purchase. We would also like to extend a sincere thanks to HCVN for live streaming this event and recording this program for future viewing. Thank you, Liz, for being with us this evening. The One Book, One Community Read project is made possible thanks to funding provided by the Friends of the Hutchinson Public Library and Thrivent. Funding for tonight's author event was made possible thanks to a grant through the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Tonight, it's our pleasure to get to welcome two really important people, and one of them is Kay Johnson. Kay features and special projects. She is the features and special projects editor with the Hutchinson Leader. Kay has been a writer all of her life, and her work has appeared in numerous publications. She has authored 4 books and has a featured program on HCVN called Off the Shelf Book Talk with Book Lovers. Not only is Kay a gifted writer and talented interviewer, she's also an avid reader and especially loves William Kent Krueger's Cork O'Connor mystery series. Teaming Kay and Kent together for tonight's program was a natural choice. Joining us from his home in St. Paul is famed Minnesota writer William Kent Krueger. While Kent now calls Minnesota home, he was raised in the Cascade Mountains of Oregon and briefly attended Stanford University. He went on to try a number of career choices, including logging timber, working construction, and trying his hand at freelance journalism. He eventually came to research child development at the University of Minnesota. Kent is now a full-time author. Many of you know Kent for his Cork O'Connor mystery series, which are set in the Northwoods of Minnesota. And these books are so popular with readers with the Hutchinson Library, we always make sure to have 2 copies on its standing order list. So good news, Kent's next Cork O'Connor mystery book is due out in August. Maybe we'll talk more about that soon. Kent is no stranger to the Hutchinson community, as his book Ordinary Grace was the featured community read in 2015. We're thrilled to have him joining us again tonight to talk more about his newest book, This Tender Land. Please give a warm Zoom welcome, which might look like a little chat of welcome. You can put something in there, some words of encouragement. Some of us maybe know how to use the reaction button, and you can either clap your hands, give a thumbs up. And I also wanted to say we have, for our evening, again, we have some questions that Kay has prepared, but if you have a question, you can always put it in the chat and we'll do our best to answer it then. So please give a warm Zoom welcome to our friend Kent and Kay. Thanks for being here.
Well, I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. And I'd like to give a special thanks to the Hutchinson Public Library One Book, One Community Read Committee and for all of the hard work that they've done to make this evening possible. I just want to say to everyone in Hutchinson and the surrounding area, I hope you understand what an important part of your community your public library is. For me, our public libraries are one of the important cornerstones of our democracy. And so the first thing I'd like to ask you to do this evening is join me in a round of applause. You can always put a reaction clap on your screen. A round of applause for all of the hard work that the library staff does on all of our behalf. Thanks very much. I'm going to begin this evening by just talking a little bit about the novel that's been chosen for the community read, This Tender Land. and then I'm going to read you just a very brief section of it so that you have a sense, for those of you who haven't read the book, have a sense of maybe what it might be like. My novel, This Tender Land, is set in the summer of 1932 during the Great Depression. It's the story of 4 orphans running from the law because they've committed a terrible crime, but for the right reason. They know if they take to the roads to get away, they're going to be caught rather quickly because a huge manhunt has been launched to capture them. They're afraid to ride the rails, as everybody was doing back in the Depression, because the railroads back then were patrolled by private cops called bulls. And the bulls had a reputation for being incredibly cruel. So the kids are afraid to ride the rails. Instead, they take to the rivers. They canoe a river called the Gilead to the Minnesota. They canoe the Minnesota River to the Mississippi, and their plan is to canoe all the way down the Mississippi River to St. Louis, where they believe they have family and they'll be safe. I have always wanted to write an updated version of Huckleberry Finn. This is my Huckleberry Finn. I'm going to read you the prologue from the novel, and I do it for 2 reasons. First of all, it's very short. It's just a little over a page long. But the other reason I like to read the prologue to audiences is that, honestly, I love this prologue. So this is how I bring readers into This Tender Land. In the beginning, after he labored over the heavens and the earth, the light and the dark, the land and sea, and all living things that dwell therein, after he created man and woman, and before he rested, I believe God gave us one final gift. Lest we forget the divine source of all that beauty, he gave us stories. I am a storyteller. I live in a house in the shade of a sycamore tree on the banks of the Gilead River. My great-grandchildren, when they visit me here, call me old. Old is a cliché, I tell them with mock disappointment. A terrible trivializing, an insult. I was born along with the sun and earth and moon and planets and all the stars. Every atom of my being was there at the very beginning. You're a liar, they scowl but playfully. Not a liar, a storyteller, I remind them. Then tell us a story, they plead. I need no goading. Stories are the sweet fruit of my existence, and I share them gladly. The events I'm about to share with you began on the banks of the Gilead. Even if you grew up in the heartland, you may not remember these things. What happened in the summer of 1932 is most important to those who experienced it, and there are not many of us left. The Gilead is a lovely river, lined with cottonwoods already ancient when I was a boy. Things were different then. Not simpler or better, just different. We didn't travel the way we do now, and for most folks in Fremont County, Minnesota, the world was limited to the piece of it they could see before the horizon cut off the land. They wouldn't have understood any more than I did that if you kill a man, you are changed forever. If that man comes back to life, you are transformed. I have witnessed this and other miracles with my own eyes. So among the many pieces of wisdom life has offered me over all these years is this. Open yourself to every possibility, for there is nothing your heart can imagine that is not so. The tale I'm going to tell is of a summer long ago, of killing and kidnapping and children pursued by demons of 1,000 names. There will be courage in this story, and cowardice. There will be love and betrayal, and of course, there will be hope. In the end, isn't that what every good story is about? All right, Kay, let's talk.
Well, Kent, just out of curiosity, the piece you just read us, did you write that when you started writing This Tender Land, or at the end, or in the beginning, or the middle? And how long did it take you to write that wonderful piece of work?
There was a lot of revision in that wonderful piece of work. Anytime you read a wonderful piece of work by any author, you're looking at a lot of revision, a lot of sweat goes into it. I actually wrote the first draft of the prologue when I was working on the second section of the novel, so well after I had begun the manuscript, I decided that I needed to ground the reader a little better in sense of place and the voice of the narrator. So I wrote the first draft of the prologue, and later on I wrote another draft of the prologue, and then another draft of the prologue. So it was across the whole course of the work, it was a work in progress itself.
Well, it certainly shows the polish that you refined it with. It's wonderful. So to begin tonight, Ken, I'm going to do a little blast to the past. And when we talked recently, you had said that you had written for 20 years before your work was read by others. How did you make that transition to becoming a published author? I believe Iron Lake was your first published novel in 1998, and it was also the first Cork O'Connor book. And so if you can tell us about that process, because how do you go from writing in your basement or in a cafe to writing a book a year for a New York publisher?
Yeah, it doesn't happen overnight, Kay.
It's not an overnight sensation, huh, Ken?
So I did serve a long apprenticeship. I didn't publish my first novel until I was 48 years old, but I was always writing, Kay. Part of the problem was simply, I'm going to blame some of that on my father. My father was a high school English teacher. When I was 18 years old, he insisted I read Ernest Hemingway, and I fell madly in love with Hemingway. Well, I liked his writing well enough, but what I really fell in love with was this mythic image of Ernest Hemingway. Here was this guy who, he had volunteered to fight in the Italian army in World War I, long before the United States became involved in that war. They put him to work driving an ambulance. He was wounded. He got a medal for it. After that, he hung out in Paris with all the great dames of the lost generation. He was a legendary brawler, drinker, big game hunter. And he'd been given the Nobel Prize in Literature for writing a kind of story nobody had ever written before. So when I was 18 years old, I wanted to be Ernest Hemingway. And I spent way too long trying to write the great American novel as he might have written it. Stupid on so many levels. But when I was in my early 40s, I kind of went through a midlife crisis and said, the hell with the great American novel. I want to write something somebody might actually want to read. So I looked around me to see what everybody reads. You know what everybody reads? They read mysteries. It's a genre whose appeal cuts across all socioeconomic levels. So I decided I was going to write a mystery. It took me 4 years to really complete the manuscript for the first Cork O'Connor novel. And I have to be honest with you, Kay. The reception that the manuscript ultimately received in New York City was just amazing. A bidding war broke out for the rights to the piece, which is every writer's dream.
Yes, that's right.
And so I kind of hit the ground running in terms of the literary scene.
Did you have an agent, Kent, at that point?
Oh, if you're going to get published by a large New York publishing house, Kay, you have to have an agent. Getting the agent is a whole nother story. So when the novel came out, it came out to great reviews. It won awards, and I have to admit that my wife and I sat down and we were both a little scared about where the road ahead was going to take us, because I quit my job and became a writer full time. I took a big leap of faith there.
Well, it paid off, Kent. So I would like to know, after the publication of Iron Lake, you were publishing Cork O'Connor books roughly every year. What inspired you to write the standalone novel Ordinary Grace? And was it a difficult transition from writing the Cork O'Connor books to this different type of book?
Yeah, let's talk about why I wrote it in the first place. Then I'll talk about writing the standalone as opposed to a Cork O'Connor mystery. I'm on a spiritual journey. I think we are all on a spiritual journey, whether we embrace this or not. And if you would read all of the books in my Cork O'Connor series, you would see that even in those stories, there is often an undercurrent that deals with the spiritual journey. It's something that comes very naturally For Cork O'Connor, he's a man with a foot in two different spiritual traditions, his white Catholicism, he's Irish Catholic, and his Ojibwe spirituality. So very often in those stories, he's trying to figure where his unique spiritual path lies. And that's always been an issue for me my whole life. So I was looking for a long time for a story that would allow me to explore more deeply the whole question of the importance of the spiritual journey in our lives. And Ordinary Grace, when I really conceived the idea fully, I realized would offer me that opportunity. So I decided, okay, this is what I'm going to do. Now, I got to tell you that when I proposed this project, Ordinary Grace, to my publisher, they didn't want it. In fact, they called me out to New York City and sat me down in kind of a panic and said, Kent, we only want Cork O'Connor novels from you. So I knew it was going to be a risky proposition, but it spoke to me in such a compelling way that I knew I had to write this story. I went about writing Ordinary Grace in a very different way than I construct my Cork O'Connor stories. I think those stories through as significantly as I can before I ever put my fingers to the keyboard. But with Ordinary Grace, I wanted a more organic process. I wanted the story really to come more from my heart. So going into the writing of Ordinary Grace, I only knew really 4 elements of the work. It was going to be about a family very like my own family. It was going to be set in a small town very like the small Midwestern towns where I'd spent my adolescence. It was going to deal with the spiritual journey, and somebody was going to be murdered because that's what I do. The writing of that experience, writing without an outline, letting the story reveal itself to me, was one of the most extraordinary experiences I've ever had as a writer, Kay.
Kent, you described Ordinary Grace and This Tender Land as companion novels. Can you elaborate on this? And then what sparked the story of This Tender Land? Were you already thinking of it when you were writing Ordinary Grace?
I think of them as companion novels for this reason. Both are set in southern Minnesota rather than the northern Minnesota, my Cork O'Connor series, and both are set in an earlier time. Ordinary Grace is the summer of 1961. This Tender Land is the summer of 1932. And they both deal with very similar themes. They both deal with the importance of the spiritual journey. They both deal with family. How is family created? What are the forces that pull family together? What are the forces that divide families? They both talk about the journey toward forgiveness and compassion, which is a very difficult journey for most of us. So I think of them as companions for those reasons. And what was the second part of the question?
What sparked the story of This Tender Land?
So when I was 11 years old, that would have been in the 5th grade, our teacher read to the class The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. She did it by reading half an hour after lunch every day. I loved that book. There was this kid, he was just like me, and he was out there on the Mississippi River having these really great adventures. And of course, after that, I had to read Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which I loved even more. And so, honestly, Kay, across my entire career as a writer, I have wanted someday to write a story that would pay homage to Mark Twain, that would be, as I said earlier, in its own way, an updated version of Huckleberry Finn. And that was the seed for This Tender Land.
Can I pop in here for a second?
Sure.
I have a question in the chat. Is that okay?
Sure.
So this goes along with that. We had a question in the chat that says, Kent, are you one of the characters in This Tender Land?
Well, I have to tell you, my favorite character that I have ever created in any of my stories is the narrator of This Tender Land, Odie O'Banion. Odie O'Banion and I are in sync with one another from the get-go. Odie is in so many ways the kid I wish I had been. Odie is, he's rebellious, he's resourceful, he's loyal. He's not above stooping to a bit of larceny if the situation calls for it. I just loved Odie. And so, in a lot of ways, I was living my own childhood vicariously through Odie, being a little more of the kid I wish I'd been when I was young. Odie's a storyteller. I'm a storyteller. Odie's spiritual journey so mirrors the spiritual journey that I'm on. So there's a lot of me in Odie. There's a lot of Odie in me.
You have said that you drawn inspiration from the works of Mark Twain, Charles Dickens, and Homer. How did you draw upon these writers for This Tender Land?
So Mark Twain is obvious. Homer Homer is important in this respect. I had tried to write this story a couple of times across my career, and I was never able to sink my teeth into it. And the reason I believe is that I had no structure for this story. I had no idea why these kids were going to be on the river, where they were coming from, where they were going. But one day, out of the blue, I thought this story is being inspired by Huckleberry Finn, but there is another story that I loved as a kid that might also be of use. My father was a high school English teacher, and he had me reading all of the great literature early. So when other kids were reading Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys, I was reading the Iliad and the Odyssey. Never cared much for the Iliad, but I loved the Odyssey. And so I thought, well, maybe what I could do is structure this story in the way Homer structured the Odyssey. So if you look at all of the sections of this tender land, each section mirrors an adventure that Odysseus had in his long journey from Troy back to Ithaca. And it was really awareness of that structure that allowed me to go forward and actually write the novel. So Homer's certainly important. Dickens, in that initial section and the evocation of the horrible environment of the Native American boarding school system, John Steinbeck is certainly influential. His profound ability to create this marvelous sense of place, I tried to capture as well. And then there's another literary influence at work that I didn't even see when I was writing the story. But as soon as it came out, readers began to write me and tell me about it. They one after another, they wrote to me and said, "We love the influence of the Wizard of Oz here." And I'm going, "What? Huh?" And then I had to look at the book, and absolutely the Wizard of Oz is there. There's the Black Witch. There's the tornado. There's the characters in search of things that they don't have. I never saw that. But Kay, what that says to me is this. There's a lot that goes on in storytelling that goes on beneath the conscious level. And that's influencing you even as you are unaware of it. It's there. Yeah. So there was the Wizard of Oz. Yep.
That's interesting. But it's true when you talk about it like that. So I would like to know, how did you become interested in the U.S. Indian boarding schools? Because I didn't even really know anything about it till I started looking at this book.
Yeah, unfortunately, most white readers have no idea of that tragic period of our history. I've been aware, because I've been working with the Native population here for a couple of decades now as a result of my Cork O'Connor series. I've been aware of the Native American boarding school system for a very long time. But in order to recreate it believably for this novel, I had to do a good deal of research. I have a lot of friends in the Native community. They are my age or younger. So they didn't go through the system, but their parents did, or their aunties and uncles did, or their grandparents did. But whenever I asked one of my friends to tell me what their relatives told them about the experience to a person, they said they won't talk about it. They simply refused to talk about it. It was such a horrific experience for them. They don't want to recall it. So I had to do a good deal of research to make sure that I got it right. And I knew that most white readers were completely unaware of the fact that from the late 1880s until 1978, when the National Indian Child Welfare Act was passed, if you were a Native parent and the government came to you and said, "We're going to take your children away, and we're going to cart them off to a boarding school hundreds of miles away, and you will see them infrequently, or maybe never again," there was absolutely nothing you could do about that. It was the law that you had to turn your children over to the government. And most white people are completely unaware of that situation. It wasn't part of my agenda to educate, but I certainly hoped that in writing this section, people would become aware of it.
Well, you did a fine job, Kent, on raising that awareness. I'd like to talk a little bit about your writing process. You touched on it briefly earlier about how you write a Cork O'Connor mystery versus a book like Ordinary Grace or This Tender Land. And I'm curious, at what point does the research stop, and when do you sit down and start telling your story?
Well, the research never stops, really. If I am aware of the areas that I don't know about before I begin to write the manuscript, I will do as much research as I can up front. Then I'll launch myself into the writing of the manuscript. But I always come to places where I suddenly realize, oh, I need to know about this. And I'll do the research then, or I'll write what I call a placeholder scene or a placeholder chapter. I imagine it as well as I can without all of the real details. And then when I finish the manuscript, I'll do more research and come back and rewrite that section with all the correct information in place. So it's an ongoing process. I saw Hannah come onto the screen a minute ago. Was she going to ask us a question that's been put
I think
to us?
she is.
Hannah, you're muted.
Thank
There
you.
you go.
Yes, I do have a question from someone in the chat. So, kind of a couple of questions here. One is, and actually, I'm gonna do a little backwards because it goes back to the question you just asked earlier. So the question is, do you know how the Native community feels about your books? The contributor says you do such a great job of showing their heritage. That's one part of the question.
Well, to answer that question, that's a good question. And you know, the whole discussion of cultural appropriation is an important one that we're having these days. I have no native blood in me whatsoever. So whenever I write a story, particularly in the Cork O'Connor series, I'm aware that I'm a white guy trespassing on a culture not my own. So I work very hard at trying to get it right. But I am not native. If I were, it would be a different kind of story that I write. But before I ever send off my manuscripts to my publisher, I always have at least one, usually two of my Ojibwe friends read and vet the manuscript. So I haven't said anything that's too stupid or even worse, offensive. The response that I've had to the Cork O'Connor series thus far has been from the Native readers who have contacted me, has been universally well received. I got an email that went something like this not long ago. Dear Mr. Krueger, I am the tribal librarian for the Lance Reservation. That's on the UP of Michigan. When any of our tribal members come in and don't know what they want to read, I recommend your books because for a white guy, you do a pretty good job. So far, so good. But those are the people who have contacted me. My guess is that there are readers or people out there who object to what I do, again, because I'm not native. But I do my best to put the best light on the Ojibwe community and in the South on the Dakota community, so that I'm working against stereotypes that people might be holding on to with a firm grip.
And then there's, along with this question, it was just, are there more Cork books after the one coming in August?
Yeah, the one coming in August is a book called Lightning Strike. I'm not sure if Kay and I are going to talk about it a little bit more, but it is a prequel to the Cork O'Connor series. I am within spitting distance of completing the manuscript for the next book in the Cork O'Connor series, which will be out the following August of 2022. And then this summer, I hope to begin work on my next standalone novel, which will be a companion to both Ordinary Grace and This Tender Land. I have also signed a contract for 2 more books in the Cork O'Connor series beyond those. So I will be giving you Cork stories for quite some time.
That's good news, Kent. As a fan, that makes you very happy.
Yeah, it makes me happy as an author to know that my publisher likes me and that readers are buying the books.
That's true. That's true. So, what can you tell us about the next standalone book? Anything yet?
I really can't, Kay, for a couple of reasons. In the same way that I only knew a few salient things about Ordinary Grace in This Tender Land when I went into the writing of it, I only know a few salient elements of this particular story. I know that it will take place in the Minnesota River Valley, the same territory that Ordinary Grace and This Tender Land covered. It will also be set in an earlier time, and it will deal with many of the same themes I've dealt with in the past. That's about all I'm willing to say at the moment. You know, Hemingway never talked about one of his stories while he was writing it, while he was working on it, because he was afraid that it would dissipate the energy of the project. And I hold sort of the same fear myself, so I don't talk a lot about that.
Now, Kent, we can expect this when? Do you anticipate releasing it?
I asked when we negotiated the contract for that novel, I asked for 2 years to write it. So what probably will happen, Kay, is I'll have a Cork O'Connor novel out this year. I'll have a Cork O'Connor novel out next year. Then I'll go 2 years. And in 2 years, the next standalone will be released.
Well, at least we know what you'll be doing, Kent.
I know.
So
I have to tell you, Kay, I'm thrilled about what I'm going to be doing. I'm so excited about all of this.
Well, so are we. Trust me, Kent, because your next standalone novel will probably be our third One Book, One Community.
One can hope.
Yeah, we can only hope, but I have faith. So I would like to know, what is the best advice you have received about writing or your writing particularly?
Do you know, I have two mantras that were given to me when I became a published author. And the first one was this: somebody else's success is not my failure. You know, professional envy of colleagues whose work is getting awards or great reviews or great notoriety or for whatever. It's easy to feel a little down because of that. And I try not to do that. What I try to do is, as best I'm able, is to celebrate the accomplishments of my colleagues, because it sure makes me feel better, you know?
Yeah.
And the other mantra that I hold, which goes right along with that, is comparison is the thief of joy. So I try not to compare myself to anyone else, to the work they do or to the accolades that come their way. I try to find joy in writing the best story, the best damn story I can write.
Well, that's good for you, Kent. That's good advice. So I would like to know, you've experienced much success as a published author, from receiving top awards in your field to being a New York Times best-selling author. What recognition has given you the biggest thrill and why?
Well, I got to tell you, the most exciting thing that ever happened to me was this. When I told you that, let me tell you the story of how Iron Lake, my first novel, came to be picked up by a publisher. I finished that novel in the mid-1990s, and I did what you were supposed to do back then. I queried 36 New York agents about the manuscript. I got 6 replies from them. All of them said, no, thank you very much. These were form letters, and they had been Xeroxed, and the level of interest in my work was clearly communicated to me, because 2 of those form letters had been Xeroxed crooked on the page. But about that point in time, some friends of mine who also wanted to be mystery writers attended a mystery writers conference in Chicago, and when they came back, they said, we've got your agent. The keynote speaker that year was a woman named Jane Jordan Brown, who had a literary agency in Chicago, and her keynote speech was, how do you get an agent? My friends brought me back a tape of her talk, and when I listened to that tape, it seemed to me what Jane was saying to these would-be writers is, this isn't how you get just any old agent. This is how you get me, Jane Jordan Brown, as your agent. And when I listened really carefully, it seemed to me mostly what she was saying to the writers there was, if you want to get me, Jane Jordan Brown, as your agent, you should say something very nice about me in your query letter. So I came up with a great compliment to pay Jane. I opened my query letter with it. I sent it off to her. 2 weeks later, I get a call from her saying, I want to see your manuscript. I sent it to Jane. 6 weeks later, she got back to me. 6 weeks, that's a pretty good turnaround time. We signed a good agent. But she said, I'm not going to represent you. Your manuscript is too long. It was 500 pages. She said, I can't sell a first author manuscript this long, but if you're willing to cut it by 100 pages, I'll be happy to take a look at it. 100 pages, that was like asking me to cut off my right arm. But if that's what it was going to take, that's what I was going to do. So I reeled it back in, and over the course of the next year, I actually cut it by 120 pages. I sent it back to Jane. She said, this is exactly what I was looking for. I will represent you. Let's go. She sent that manuscript in November of that particular year to 6 of the largest New York publishing houses with this very bold demand. Do you want to publish Kent's manuscript? Give us an answer by Christmas. Now, what I didn't know about the publishing business was nothing happens at Christmas. For 2 weeks before Christmas and 2 weeks after Christmas, they leave the city. They go to, the Poconos or the Berkshires of Florida, wherever they go for vacation, and the publishing business grinds to a halt. So Christmas rolls around, we haven't heard anything. New Year's rolls around, we still haven't heard anything. I still remember this. really bleak night in the middle of January. I'm sitting at the kitchen table. My wife's beside me, trying to console me. I've got my head in my hands, and I'm whining something like, "Nobody wants my book. Nobody wants my book." Well, I get a call from Jane the next day, or it might have been the day after that, saying, "Somebody wants your book." She explained that it was an offer from St. Martin's Press, one of the really fine mystery imprints in New York City. She said it's not a lot of money. It's a first author contract, but somebody wants your book. I said, "Wonderful, Jane, where do I sign?" And she said, "You're not going to sign because I think you're going to get another offer." The next day we got an offer from Simon & Schuster, and it was a much better offer. I said, "Wonderful, Jane, where do I sign?" And she said, "You're not going to sign because I called St. Martin's and told them about Simon & Schuster's offer. I think they'll make a counteroffer." The next day we got a counteroffer from St. Martin's. They said, "Not only will we give him more money for Iron Lake, we know he's at work on another novel. We'll buy that one too." I said, "Wonderful, Jane. Where do I sign?" And she said, "You're not going to sign because I called Simon & Schuster and told them about St. Martin's offer. I think they'll make a counteroffer." And the next day we got a 2-book counteroffer from Simon & Schuster that was so lucrative that we had to accept it. And honestly, as those offers were coming and going back and forth, I was just in seventh heaven. Kay, as I said, it's every writer's dream to have a bidding war break out between publishing houses for the right to your work. For my very first published manuscript, that dream came true for me. That was such a high moment for me.
Well, it's a wonderful story, Kent. A fairy tale.
And here's Hannah.
True.
Hello. I like popping in. So this is kind of going back a little bit, but I think it's a nice question. And you maybe sort of touched on this too, Kent, but the question was, let me find it, roll up a little bit here. How did you get interested in the American Indian community and their heritage in boarding schools generally? Sure.
I have to admit, my decision to begin writing about the Ojibwe as an element of my Corporal Connor series was a mercenary decision. When I knew I wanted to write a mystery, well, here's a confession coming from a writer of mysteries. Before I began to write mysteries, I didn't read them. As I said, I didn't even read Nancy Drew or the Hardy Boys growing up. So I had a lot of learning to do if I was going to write a mystery. And so I began to read them. And one of the first authors I read, fortunately I stumbled across, was a guy named Tony Hillerman, who is an icon in the mystery genre. He wrote a series that's set in the Four Corners area of the Southwest and deals significantly with the culture of the Navajo, the Diné. And I thought, well, nobody's doing that with the Ojibwe here in Minnesota. Maybe that's what I ought to do. When I made that decision, what did I know about the culture of the Anishinaabe? About what every white person knows about the native cultures we live shoulder to shoulder with? Nothing. But I was a cultural anthropology major in college, so the idea of learning about the Ojibwe was exciting to me. And I began in the way every good academic begins. I began by reading. But across the course of my research, I began to meet members of the Ojibwe community and form relationships that have become important friendships to me over time. And so I have come to an enormous appreciation and admiration for the culture of the Ojibwe and in the southern part of the state, the Dakota. And I do my best to include them in the stories that I write, because I think if you set a story in Minnesota, it's almost impossible to not to include the native population here, because the influence of our native cultures here is ubiquitous. It's powerful and it's everywhere. So that's where it comes from.
Hannah, do you have any more questions?
I do, but
No, go
we
ahead.
can turn this over now to questions that have come in from the audience, if you want.
Okay, awesome. So one question is, the person is asking, what role does your spouse play in the creative process?
Well, I have to say, honestly, this is not an exaggeration. I'm able to do what I do today because of my wife. When she married me, she knew that I wanted to be a writer. I told her up front I was not going to be a very good breadwinner. I was never going to be a career person because I wanted to be a writer. And she was on board with that. She has been behind me all the way, supported me in this journey to reach this dream of mine every step of the way. So first of all, she has been my moral support. I owe everything to her, honest to God. She is also usually my earliest reader in a manuscript. Now, I don't ask her to be an editor. I don't ask her to be a critiquer. I just want to get her feel. Is it a good story? Was there anything about it that troubled you? So she responds that way. But that's really all I ask of her. I don't want to put the weight of trying to help make my manuscript better on her shoulders. I have an agent and an editor whose responsibility that is.
That's really sweet. Thank you for answering that question. This is a really good question too. The question is, has your spiritual journey been tender or tragic?
You know, I would never call anyone's spiritual journey tragic. We often walk through the fire, but I think you have to walk through the fire because you come out on the other side a different person, hopefully a better person. So I've walked through my fires. I think we all have. But I wouldn't call that tragic. What's tragic to me is when you lose your faith, when you no longer feel as if you are on a spiritual journey, that you have abandoned this journey or the journey has abandoned you. One of the messages I was trying to get through, particularly with this tender land, is that as long as we hold the hope, we're going to make it to the end. We're going to be there all right. It's only when we lose hope that we're lost. And that's maybe when we enter the tragic part. We've lost our hope. We've lost our spiritual, a sense of our spiritual journey. I hope that helps.
For sure. I have a question, Kent, because I read the book. So I'm not writing in the chat, but right now we don't have anything yet. So if we don't see anything in a couple of minutes here, I'll give it back to Kay. And then I also have some other questions too. But I love the character, and right now I don't have my book by me. The singer, the woman, what was her name? Or from the tent revival.
Sister Eve.
Thank you. I love Sister Eve. What a beautiful character. What was the inspiration for that character? Who? Or, yeah.
Sure. Well, let me talk about the inspiration for the whole Sword of Gideon Healing Crusade section, the evangelistic tent revival show. My father grew up in Oklahoma, and he was there during the Dust Bowl years. And I remember him telling stories about watching it rain mud from the sky and going out to scrounge wild greens to supplement what was on the dinner table. He grew up in a family that was very fundamentalist in his approach to religion. So he went to lots of tent revival shows when he was a kid. He was saved many, many times. And I love the stories he used to tell about that. I have never been to a tent revival myself, but because I love those stories, I knew someday I was going to include that experience in one of the stories that I wrote. And this just seemed the perfect story to include it. I did a lot of research for the tent revival shows, but I have to be honest that a lot of my creation of that section came from Sinclair Lewis in his novel Elmer Gantry. Sinclair Lewis was known as an assiduous researcher. And so when he did Elmer Gantry, he really did a lot of research about tent revival shows. His agenda was to debunk them. I had a different agenda. But one of the characters in Elmer Gantry is a tent evangelist named Sharon Falconer, who's a wonderfully complex character. She is a woman of the world. She smokes, she drinks, she carouses with Elmer, but she's also a woman who believes profoundly that God has tapped her to deliver a loving message to the world. And I've always thought, just what a wonderfully complicated character. So that was the foundation. That was the beginning of my thinking for Sister Eve. But I wanted Sister Eve. Do you know, as a mystery writer, one of the things I love to do is introduce a character to readers in such a way that they don't know how to read that character. And then I love slowly turning their understanding around until they finally see the true nature of the character, which is exactly what I did with Sister Eve. So I knew readers were going to be suspect in the beginning, but I hoped in the end they would, as you have, fall in love with her as much as I loved her.
Thank you. I selfishly appreciate you answering that question. Right now, we don't have any questions in the chat, so I'm going to hand it back to Kay. Does that sound all right?
Unmute, and I can take it.
There you go.
Ken, I'd like to flip to Cork O'Connor, and I'd like you to tell, where did you come up with the idea of Henry below in your Cork O'Connor series, because he's certainly one of my very favorite characters, and I know I'm not alone in those sentiments.
Yeah, he is the favorite character probably of most readers of the series. He's certainly my favorite character. I love writing the scenes in which Henry Malou is going to play a part. The interesting thing about those scenes is I almost never have to rewrite them. Whatever Henry says is exactly what Henry was supposed to say. God only knows why. And maybe it's because those things come from the same place Henry came from. One of the experiences that every storyteller has is this: we are given gifts. We have no idea where they come from. They just fall into our laps, and all we can say is, thank you, Lord, for this. And that's where Henry came from. He just came out of the blue for me. In Iron Lake, the first novel, he plays an important part, but he's not fully realized until several stories later. He really begins to take center stage in every story. For those who aren't familiar with my Cork O'Connor series, Henry Malou he's the closest thing I write to a stock character, the wise old medicine man. He's a Midday. He's a member of the Grand Medicine Society. He's a healer. He is very, very old. But he is also, he's wise. He is compassionate. He's courageous. He's funny. He farts a lot. And he is the guy that Cork turns to whenever things are so knotted up that Cork doesn't know which way is up. Henry never offers him answers. Henry typically presents him with kind of a riddle. And when Cork solves the riddle, he understands the wisdom that Henry has been offering him. Now, Henry Malou is 105 as I'm writing him now. And I have put him in some precarious, the last novel put him in a precarious situation. And the novel I'm working on now resolves that situation. But I'm not going to tell you how Henry turns out in the end there.
Oh, you're a tough one.
I'll wait for readers to read that one.
A quick follow-up for that, and I'm not familiar, but I'm intrigued. Question is, will Wabu inherit Henry's gifts?
That's a very little Wabu, little rabbit. Aaron Small Dog O'Connor. He is Cork O'Connor's grandson. He is also of mixed heritage, and he may have inherited Stephen O'Connor. Cork's son sees visions, and Wabu may also have inherited that ability. Now, there are a lot of people that go, "Oh, visions." I have to tell you, my mother was a seer. She had visions. When I was a kid, it wasn't uncommon for the telephone to ring and my mother would know who it was. She would say, "Oh, it's Aunt Joanne and there's trouble." And it was Aunt Joanne and there was trouble. Or she would toss and turn in her bed for several nights and she would say, "Something bad is coming, something bad is coming." And sure enough, something bad is coming. So when I write of people who have an understanding of the world that many of the rest of us do not, it's out of my own experience. I absolutely believe that these things exist.
I have another question for you. When you begin a story, do you build an outline or have a concept of the plot, or do the story and the characters unfold as you write?
It's a good question, and the answer is just that it depends on the kind of story I'm writing. If I'm writing a story in my Cork O'Connor series, those are all essentially mysteries. And a mystery is a very tightly woven fabric of storytelling. Everything depends so significantly on everything else. So when I write a story in my Cork O'Connor series, typically what I do is I think that story through as completely as I can before I ever put my fingers to the keyboard. At the end of that thinking process, I know how the story begins, I know how it ends, I know who did what to whom and why. But when I write a story, one of my standalones, Ordinary Grace of This Tender Land, I look purposefully for a different process. I want a more organic process. I want these stories to feel as if they come from my heart, a personal storytelling. And so I only, in Ordinary Grace in This Tender Land, going into them, I only knew a few salient elements of the story before I began to write them. And then I let the stories reveal themselves to me. And those have been extraordinary processes, extraordinary creative processes. And that's how I'm going to approach my next standalone. As much as possible, I want the story to reveal itself to me.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
No other
Lord.
questions right now.
Okay. Kent, we're closing in on an hour. And so I'm curious, do you have any advice for writers who may be listening to this conversation we're having?
Yeah, my first piece of advice to writers always is this: write every day, every single day. Carve out some time. Doesn't have to be a lot of time. It can be half an hour, it can be 45 minutes, but do it every day. And it's important for two reasons. First of all, it's important that those around you understand that this is your writing time. They expect not to bother you in this writing time. It becomes just part of what everybody understands. But the other thing is that it will bring home to you the importance to you of the writing. And finally, what it does for you is this: it keeps you connected with the energy of whatever project you're working on. If you're away from that project for a while, you lose that energy, you lose the thread of connection. And God help you if you can't pick it up again. The other piece of advice I have for you is this: write. There's really, for me, there's really only one reason to write, and that's because you love it. Don't expect to get rich and famous from your writing. That probably won't happen. But if you're writing because you're doing what you love to do, then you're following your passion, and what could be better than that?
I totally agree with it, Kent. Hannah, are there any other questions?
Yeah, we just had one pop in. Which is more difficult, plot or character development?
That's sort of like asking what's more important, your heart or your lungs. I have to admit, plot is the least interesting part of a story to me, but it's the part I spend the most time thinking about. I far prefer working with character, with setting, with language, than with plot itself. Plot is really the skeleton of the story. It's what all of the beautiful meat, the flesh, the emotion of the story hangs on. So you have to have a really good, solid plot in place. And so I work really hard at plots. And that's the sweat work of the writing for me. So I more enjoy everything else, but I probably put more effort into plot.
Another question is, and I think we'll do a few more, just a couple more questions.
Sure.
What re-energizes you to keep writing new stories?
Do you know, when I'm writing the Cork O'Connor series, just the fact, I write a series in which all of the characters age and change over time, relationships change. And so every time I sit down to write a new story in my Cork O'Connor series, I'm not writing about the people. I'm not writing about the same people. Things have happened in their lives and time has passed. And so they're different in how they respond to the world, how they see themselves, how they see each other. That really keeps it fresh for me. Also, periodically I write standalone novels, and that's an entirely different kind of experience and a very refreshing experience. I have yet to feel like this is an onerous task that I do. Even writing a novel pretty much every year in my Cork O'Connor series, I have no problem with that. I look forward to it. I always look forward to the standalones with excitement, something new, something different, something unknown to me as I'm going to go into the launching of it. Another journey ahead of me, an adventure. So that's kind of how I look at it, and what keeps me interested and right there in the middle of it.
That's awesome. It's very encouraging, inspiring. Has your editor ever rejected a concept?
Yeah, they didn't like Ordinary Grace when I pitched the novel to them. They were not excited about a novel that dealt with a spiritual journey. They wanted just straight mysteries from me. But I'll tell you, when I finished the manuscript, even though they didn't want it, I went ahead and sent it to my editor at Simon & Schuster. She fell in love with it. She said, of course, we're going to publish it. And they really got behind that novel in a big way.
Another question just popped up. The question is, do you think one needs to read Ordinary Grace before this tender land?
No, they are completely unrelated. The stories, the characters, everything is completely unrelated. You could read one first and then the other. It matters not the order in which you read them. The Cork O'Connor series is a little different because everybody ages across the course of this. They age 15 years across the course of the 70 novels. It's a much richer experience if you begin at the beginning and read them in order. But you don't have to do that.
Well, it looks like we don't have no more in the chat right now. Thank you for those that are participating in the chat. It's really helpful to get those questions.
I think we're pretty much at the end of our hour. We've had a great conversation.
This has been awesome. Kay and Ken, thank you so much for having this great conversation. Kay, thank you for hosting and being an engaging interviewer. And Ken, thank you for being willing to offer your time and insight to your books. Personally, I've only read one, and I'm so excited to read more. I'm going to do a little wrap up here, but while I'm doing, or Kent, do you have something you want to say?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to you, Hannah, for all that you've done to help facilitate this. Thanks to all of the people behind the scenes, the One Book, One Community Read Committee, and everybody, all the staff at the Hutchinson Public Library. And thank you, Kay, for all of your thoughtful questions. They were just delightful.
Well, it's lovely to see you again, Kent, and I still look forward to talking with you again in the future.
I'm sure we will.
Yes, I hope so.
And it looks like this is already happening. Thanks for those of you that are writing some words of gratitude. If you have any thanks you want to throw out, maybe a favorite moment of the evening, some words of encouragement for Kay or Kent. Usually when we're together, we do a round of applause, but obviously we're not together right now. But thank you for those little chats coming in. You can keep those coming. And just as Ken said, thank you for joining us this evening. We had 40, at one point, almost 50 folks in the chat, and even more folks that are joining us from home on HCVN. We are just grateful that you're here for One Book, One Community for the virtual author program. Hopefully we'll be together in person this upcoming year. There are many who work behind the scenes to make this program possible, and we want to extend our thanks again to all those program planners, collaborators, and sponsors. Following this event, a survey evaluation form will be sent to your email. Your feedback of this Legacy Fund program is greatly appreciated. So if you're willing, please fill that out. If you are watching this event via HCVN, you can also stop by the library to pick up an evaluation form. Feedback gathered will help us to secure future Legacy Grant funding. And also, please sure to write down any titles you may have for this upcoming community read. Again, super grateful for everyone joining us. We had some really fun chats. We have Texas Snowbird joined us. Thank you. I truly enjoyed the book and Kent's presentation. Thanks so much, Kent, Kay, and Hannah, for making this a new way of engaging our community and read in such a great way. We got some thanks, thoroughly enjoyable. Thank you for a great evening. Enjoyed this so much, and just lots of gratitude all around. So thank you to everyone for being here. Thank you again, Kent, for your time, and keep on writing.
Everyone
you,
keep
Hannah.
reading.
Yeah, and we'll
Yes,
keep reading.
yes.
That's good too. Thanks, everybody.